It's a wild world out there, but some worlds are even wilder. Hi, I'm Tyler Hapney, and you're listening to Dungeons and Dystopias. Thank you for listening. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Dungeons and Dystopias. I am your game master and host, Tyler Hapney. I have run over a combined total of 200 sessions of both Dungeons and Dragons and Cyberpunk. So this podcast is me rambling to you about my thoughts on either system. Last week, we had a friend of mine, Jordan, come in, and he and I discussed quite a bit of some of my what goes on in some of my games. This week, I think we're going to direct our attention a bit more towards the fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons side of things. So in particular, I wanted to discuss the Forgotten Realms and Faerun as a whole, because I've had some time to discuss Night City, but I haven't taken the time yet to exactly explain the Forgotten Realms and Faerun and the traditional D&D setting for a lot of people, which, I mean, if you've played Baldur's Gate 3, watched the Dungeons and Dragons movie, or engaged with any D&D media for about the last 20, 30 years, you have engaged with the Forgotten Realms setting, because for the most part, that's what they release to the public, is the Forgotten Realms stuff. And that was all created by this guy, this Canadian dude named Ed Greenwood, who doesn't really, well, he writes for the setting, but he's not officially with Wizards of the Coast, the people who publish Dungeons and Dragons now. But a lot of his lore is foundational to the Forgotten Realms, and he's written a ton of books and other things to kind of capitalize on that setting he wrote, apparently when he was just a kid. But Ed Greenwood was sort of the creator, and it is kind of your, I don't, it sounds weird to say, but it is kind of a standard fantasy world. But it is, it's one of those things where the creators have thought of pretty much just about everything, down to the economics of a region. Like this particular region, is specializes in exports of iron and silver because of mines that are located 2 miles to the northwest. Very specific kind of things like that, and you have that for pretty much every town, every city. You've got your own kingdoms, nations, things like that, and each one of these kingdoms and nations, they're so well developed and so intricate that obviously the design is so that you can run a campaign anywhere that you want in this setting, and I think they do that really well. In fact, I've talked a lot about my own stuff in the Forgotten Realms, and I've been really getting kind of into writing for that particular setting, and just writing for, I guess, a standard fantasy setting is also nice, because a lot of the campaigns I've ran have been so off the wall insane before that just having something normal feels like an exception sometimes. But for the Forgotten Realms, crossing back to that, it's referred to the Forgotten Realms, I believe, because it was implied to be like something time or history forgot. Back in the older editions, it was a bit more tied to things on Earth and stuff like that. But nowadays, they've pretty deviated from that path, which is fine. Personally, I don't find any issue with divorcing, the Forgotten Realms from our known realms. Faerun is the continent, I think it's the continent. I don't think it's the planet. The planet is Toril. That's right. The Faerun is the continent that a lot of this stuff happens on, and 5th edition in particular, I don't want to say current edition of D&D, but the previous edition of D&D before what you would call D&D 2024 or 5.5e, if you wanted to be technical. But the 5th edition mostly took place when they went to the Faerun. It mostly took place along a location called the Sword Coast, which is just the coast of Faerun. It's from north to south. There's a ton of very important cities along that span or stretch of coastline. Some of these cities being some of the most famous locations in the Forgotten Realms. Baldur's Gate, Waterdeep, places like that. I mean, Baldur's Gate, there's literally an entire video game franchise named after the location. You go there in every game. I mean, Baldur's Gate 3, they kind of wait, a bit, but you get there eventually. So, I mean, the Sword Coast is, I think, overwhelmingly the most common place people are going to be seeing in Dungeons and Dragons media. Like, I'm pretty sure the Dungeons and Dragons movie that came out, No Honor Among Thieves, whatever, that all took place on the Sword Coast as well, around the city of Neverwinter, which is just not that far away from Waterdeep. So there's a lot of stuff that happens on the Sword Coast. But lately, a lot of people have been kind of commenting on this. Not a lot of stuff going on anywhere else in Faerun for some reason. They don't seem to want to cover some of the more lesser touched on regions, places that haven't really been talked about since 3.5e back in the early 2000s or late 1990s. Like, for instance, one of the locations I'm running one of my own campaigns in, the Dalelands, which is one of Ed Greenwood's favorite locales in the Forgotten Realms. It's pretty much just, if you've ever played World of Warcraft or anything like that, it's your Elwyn Forest. It's your starting zone. It really does feel like the your stereotypical kind of fantasy sort of, I don't want to say Hobbiton, but it almost has that sort of whimsy to it. The region itself, the Dalelands it's a large, I don't want to say plains, but it's more it's a forest, farmland, but it's a large land that's split up into multiple tiny little dales. For instance, they have Battledale, Daggerdale, Shadowdale, Featherdale, Mistledale, Harrowdale. Just a lot of dales out there, and that's fun to play with. But the dales they're like a sleepy little farming community. Some of them kind of sort of differ between each other. I mean, all of the dales differ between each other. Some of them hate each other, which I think is really funny because, I mean, how micro can your problems get where you're feuding with someone from Tasseldale just because they're from Tasseldale, and it doesn't even matter what's beyond your own current region. It's sort of a lot like that. But I mean, Wizards of the Coast hasn't touched the Dalelands since the 90s. They've talked about it. They've referenced it. They've talked about, Shadowdale, places like that, but they haven't had anything happen there for a while. I mean, I think 4th edition briefly touched on the area, but not a lot of people really look at 4th edition lore. It was sort of a black sheep. I personally do, but a lot of that stuff happened there weren't campaigns made around it. It was all, this happened in a book or a novel or something like that. Something where no one actually played anything or any of these events. They happened because an author dictated them to. And that just doesn't feel right to me. So that's why I was like, hey, let's touch on a place like the Dalelands that hasn't had anything significant happen in it recently. And that's how that campaign started. Going pretty well. They haven't left Shadowdale yet, but we're going to be getting there next session. Going to start exploring southward into Mistledale, going along the river. But yeah, I mean, the Dalelands is a very interesting place. The primary enemy that you're going to be running across in the Dalelands, at least in my campaign, are the Zentarum. The Zentarum are an old school D&D enemy. In fact, they almost seem to be the de facto kind of big bad guys in D&D for a while. But Wizards of the Coast have sort of drifted away from that in favor of some of the more, Famous people and villains and enemies within Dungeons and Dragons, people like Manchun and Waterdeep Dragon Heist, stuff like that, which Manchun himself is part of the Zentarum, but there's a lot to go into on that one. I guess I should probably say Manchuns. I say that, of course, because Manchun is like 6 clones now. He has been for a while. I think he might even be more than 6, but the leader of the Zentarum is technically multiple people and has been for a really, really long time. Just multiple of the same guy. Yeah, it's fun stuff like that. Or why the Zentarum are so interesting. But their whole goal as an organization is trade dominance. This is where we're kind of getting into some of the more geopolitical stuff that they think about when they write Forgotten Realms. Basically, the original goal of the Zentarum was that they were going to own all the trade routes from the sort of eastern part of Faerun into the western part of Faerun and the Sword Coast. And they generally did a pretty good job at that. They have several large outposts along major trade routes that they use to basically enforce their iron will upon the people of the region. And they do that with great amount of success. They're one of the most common secret societies in all of Faerun. You can probably find a Zentara member in just about any major city you go to. They will typically be there, and usually they'll have some fun jobs, or maybe they'll be trying to do some pretty shady stuff. Who knows? But there's a lot there that you can you can work with. In the Dalelands particularly, the Zentarum have a ton of history. They are, they're kind of the big bad guys of the whole region. Zentarum invasions are pretty frequent, or at least they used to be, back when the Zentarum ran out of a location called Zental Keep, which was destroyed during 4th edition lore. And is now being rebuilt in 5th edition lore. So the Zentarum are back in the region, which automatically tells me that, hey, there might be another invasion soon. That's a campaign right there, and that is my campaign. The Zentarum are back, and with Baldur's Gate 3 and 5th edition bringing back a lot of gods that were killed, particularly Bane, who the Zentarum are religiously involved with. I feel like the time is now for the Zentarum to make a comeback. We are so back right now. It's going to be great. Other than that, the Dalelands, they also have a bit of a problem with, I want to say, the Underdark. Which we talked about last episode, but the Underdark is essentially the Hollow Earth beneath the ground in a lot of these places, and it's interesting. There's an entire species of elves that thrive there called the Drow Elf. They're the dark elves of the D&D setting, and well, there's been a lot of problems with the Underdark around Shadowdale and sort of the Elven Woods that are in the region of the Dalelands. So not only are they dealing with criminals trying to disrupt their trade routes and invade them, they are also dealing with underground invaders and threats and things like that. And not to mention, I mean, we're barely even getting into it, Cyric, the god of deceit, lies, and trickery, also has his eyes on Zental Keep and has for a long time. So, of course, you also have to deal with the followers of Cyric, who are still within the region and 100% are also wanting to invade the place. You could probably see where a decent campaign is starting to form. But that's about all I'm going to talk about the Dalelands today. In fact, I think now I'd like to move on to today's segment, where we our recurring segment where we talk about our favorite monsters. And last week we talked about a monster in the Dungeons and Dragons universe, the Flumph, a classic. But today I'd like to talk about a universe different from the D&D universe. I'd like to talk about a more metaphorical monster. Yes, today's monster is actually going to be a mega corporation from Cyberpunk Red. And today I'd like to talk a lot about my favorite mega corporation, Savoil. Now, Savoil is the Russian government. They took over the Russian government sometime in the late 2010s. It's important to note that in the cyberpunk universe, the Soviet Union did not collapse. It went through a series of capitalistic reforms, so to speak, kind of similar to the way it was going before it just totally crumbled. But what's important is the Russian government was weakened pretty heavily by this, and it got to the point where an oil megacorporation within Russia was able to basically dominate the Russian government economically, financially. They pulled out of, sort of the Russian council, the Russian government entirely, basically seceded. And it was then that they learned that they had more power than the Russian government, so they just kind of took over. With that came the responsibility of running a pretty tight ship when it comes to being in Russia. They wound up in a large dispute with Petrochem, an American oil megacorporation, or are they Australian? One of the two. Either way, Petrochem and Sovoil just going at it overseas, within the ocean. It was a lot of pretty nasty stuff. But nowadays, Sovoil isn't exactly as publicly fighting against Petrochem as they used to be. But, I mean, in my campaign, it's kind of hard to forget a giant corporate war that is still technically going on behind the scenes. So Sovoil and Petrochem are still at each other's throats. And boy, oh boy, are they willing to throw just about anyone under the bus to get a leg up on the competition. And that is why Sovoil is today's Monster of the Week. Tune in next week where I have my friend and a professional game master, Cam, come in, and he is going to talk to us a little bit about D&D 2024, or D&D 5e, as I mentioned earlier on in the podcast. As for now, I have been Tyler Hapney. Thank you so much for listening, and please tune in next week to Dungeons and Dystopias.